When we first started describing RBD at national and international meetings, both Mark Mahald and I received some comments from people about, quote, the Minnesota disease. In other words, they thought this was a strange condition that was found in Minnesota, but they were skeptical about whether it existed elsewhere. And I think this speaks to the fact that people, as a natural tendency, when they confront the unknown, tend to distance themselves from the unknown. And in that case, they said, well, we live away from Minnesota. This is a Minnesota disease. And of course, now we know that this is not just a Minnesota disease. It's spread out everywhere. For example, it's in Iowa and Wisconsin, and maybe it's in North Dakota. I'm just kidding. It's a worldwide phenomenon. But it's a universal phenomenon in terms of middle-aged and older adult males, regardless of what country and what continent. Furthermore, as we studied our original cohort of RBD patients and focused on those that were initially diagnosed with idiopathic RBD, we recognized that over time there was a very specific association with the delayed emergence of a Parkinsonian disorder, such as Parkinson's disease, dementia with Lewy bodies, and multiple system atrophy. And in fact, in 1996, we published an article in the journal Neurology entitled Delayed Emergence of a Parkinsonian Disorder in 38% of 29 older men initially diagnosed with idiopathic REM sleep behavior disorder. And we identified a very specific association with the delayed onset of a Parkinsonian disorder. And that kicked off great interest in the fields of sleep medicine, neurology, and neuroscience, believing that RBD could be the first manifestation of a future Parkinsonian disorder. And that, of course, created great interest in trying to find a neuroprotective agent to prevent the progression of RBD into Parkinsonism. Furthermore, there's a small army of RBD researchers spread out throughout the world that are conducting really outstanding research. Research done under the auspices of Dr. Jacques Monplaisir in Montreal, Alex Aranzo and his colleagues at the University of Barcelona, including Juan Santamaria, and Brad Bavay and his colleagues at Mayo Clinic, tremendous researchers. And basically, we all agree now that well over 50% of men age 50 and older, and maybe as high as 80% and ultimately maybe 100% of men age 50 and older with idiopathic REM sleep behavior disorder will eventually develop a Parkinsonian disorder such as Parkinson's disease, multiple system atrophy, dementia with Lewy bodies, or a pure autonomic failure. And in fact, the lag period between the onset of RBD and the onset of a future Parkinsonian disorder is now known to be as much as 50 years. In our series, and we're up to now 81% conversion from idiopathic RBD to Parkinsonism, is about a 14-year lag period. In Barcelona, it's about a 12-year lag period. But we all agree that it's probably going to be 100% the longer you follow these patients up. On the other hand, virtually all categories of neurologic disorders can trigger RBD. And these are patients who come to us with a history of RBD emerging with their neurologic disorder. And we have to thank the basic scientists for understanding this association, because there's an active inhibitory pathway that subserves the REM sleep atonia. And we now know that any interruption of that pathway by any neurologic disorder can result in REM sleep behavior disorder, provided that there's also disinhibition of the motor pattern generators in the brainstem that generate the problematic behaviors of RBD. So I think RBD, among other things, is a wonderful model of the interaction and the mutual reinforcement of basic sleep science and clinical sleep medicine. We both need each other to advance our research efforts, and also on behalf of our patients. And there's an interesting little twist to the story, and that is, because of the animal model of RBD, we understood RBD and could then treat it with clonazepam, and in turn, the veterinarians treating spontaneous animal RBD, in other words, dogs and cats that are pets, that are brought to the veterinary clinic, they're treated with clonazepam to control their spontaneous RBD. So I think there's a wonderful kind of a circle involved in terms of clinical medicine and sleep research. We now also know that there's a very strong association of RBD and narcolepsy, which is another REM sleep disorder with state boundary dyscontrol. And this is true of narcolepsy in children and adults. There's an HLA association, DQW1. 84% of our series of RBD patients were DQW1 positive, which is far more than the general population. And it shares that feature of narcolepsy, but does not share the DR2 feature of narcolepsy. Nevertheless, it does raise the intriguing possibility that perhaps RBD is an autoimmune disorder to some extent, at least to the extent that narcolepsy might be, although we don't know the exact mechanism of narcolepsy apart from the hypocretin cells becoming destroyed and degenerated with narcolepsy. We also know that RBD can be combined with the disorders of arousal from non-REM sleep, which is called the parasomnia overlap disorder. We identified this in the 1990s and is part of the International Classification of Sleep Disorders. And there's really something for everybody with RBD, both clinically and on the research front, in terms of dream research, HLA research, neurologic disorders research. A whole new frontier involves the psychotropic medication-induced RBD, which is increasingly recognized in younger adults, both males and females. And this is in contrast to idiopathic RBD and neurologic RBD, generally associated with middle-aged and older males. Virtually all psychotropic medications, particularly the SSRIs, venlafaxine, mirtazapine, tricyclic antidepressants, MAO inhibitors, beta blockers, selegiline, but interestingly not bupropion, which is a dopaminergic, noradrenergic antidepressant, which would not be expected to trigger or aggravate RBD and has not been reported. And in fact, as one clinical example, if a patient with RBD has a clinical depression, bupropion should be considered the antidepressant of choice unless otherwise contraindicated, because we know in all likelihood it will not cause or aggravate the RBD. So I think in terms of the whole field of sleep medicine, RBD really is applicable. All sleep clinicians and researchers should be aware of RBD. Alex Aranzo and Juan Santamaria in Barcelona, for example, identified obstructive sleep apnea, hypopnea, pseudo-RBD. Middle-aged and older men were acting out violent dreams. They also had a history of snoring and excessive daytime sleepiness. And in fact, they had severe obstructive sleep apnea, hypopnea, that triggered the violent dream and acting behaviors during arousals from REM sleep and non-REM sleep. And treatment of the sleep apnea controlled not only the sleep apnea and daytime sleepiness, but also the violent dream and acting behaviors that emerged during arousals from REM and non-REM sleep. And on restudy in the lab, these patients had completely normal REM sleep atonia. So that's another example of how RBD is applicable to virtually all clinical and research settings. In 2005, I published a book called Paradox Lost: Midnight in the Battleground of Sleep and Dreams, and the cover illustrates our initial patient, Donald Dorff, in the midst of punching 12 consecutive times in his bed during dream enactment. And I wrote the book to share the stories of our initial series of patients with RBD, but also other parasomnia patients that came into our clinic to share their personal histories, what they had to go through before treatment, and also the gratifying response to the treatment. And I put as a subtitle to the cover, "Violent Moving Nightmares," in tribute to the wonderful description of our index patient, Donald Dorff. This book is available online along with a DVD documentary film called Sleep Runners, the stories behind everyday parasomnias. And in that DVD documentary, I have several patients of RBD and their wives describe their ordeal of RBD and other parasomnias before they were evaluated and treated. And that's available at www.sleeprunners.com. I should also point out that the wives of men with RBD are truly heroic people. They have suffered for years with inadvertent blows and punches, sustaining severe headaches in the process, and there has not been one case of marital separation or divorce reported in the literature on account of RBD. And I think this speaks to the loving nature of the wives, and also they knew their husbands after many decades of marriage and realized that the violent dream and acting behaviors were distinctly out of character from their very pleasant and loving personalities during the daytime. In conclusion, and this is certainly on behalf of my colleague Mark Mahald as well, and I'm truly sorry that he could not attend today because he has been a wonderful mentor for me and very supportive of everything that I've done. I want to say that my career in sleep medicine began with RBD, and RBD appeared to be on the fringe of sleep medicine, on the fringe of the parasomnias, but now it's recognized to be part and parcel of so many aspects of sleep medicine. And it's been a very rewarding experience for me to be introduced to RBD at the beginning of my career in sleep medicine. It has certainly enriched me. RBD belongs to the whole world of sleep research, and I can't wait to read new manuscripts and new publications from all my sleep medicine colleagues related to RBD. It's a very exciting field to be in. And I should also point out that there's an international RBD study group that was just formed, and I have to give tribute to my colleagues in Marburg, Germany, and Jacques Lampazier and his group in Montreal, Canada, because they have hosted the annual International RBD Study Group meetings, and I think great research will result from this type of yearly meeting and interaction of the leading researchers in the RBD field. So thank you all. It's a wonderful feeling to be part of that growing small army of RBD researchers.